They say your home is your sanctuary. But what happens when the very people sworn to protect the neighborhood turn it into a battlefield? One quiet evening, a simple choice I made inside my own property triggered a storm I never saw coming. The HOA wasn't just upset, they were furious, and soon their petty rules spiraled into threats, fines, and a shocking demand that left me stunned. I held my ground, but was it the biggest mistake of my life? When my family and I first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like the perfect place to settle down. Rows of tidy houses stretched along the lakefront, kids played on the sidewalks, and the HOA promised to protect our property values and keep things fair. On the surface, it seemed ideal, peaceful, safe, and structured. We thought we'd finally found a place where we could relax and build a life without worry. At first, the rules didn't bother me. Trash cans tucked away, lawns trimmed just right, mailboxes painted in approved colors. Annoying? Maybe, but manageable. Everyone nodded and smiled at board meetings, and the HOA president, sharp suit, polished smile, gave off the air of someone who was more concerned with appearances than community spirit. Still, I told myself it was harmless. Our cabin by the lake became my refuge. I spent weekends there, fixing the dock, sipping coffee on the porch, and watching the sun rise over the water. It was one of the few places where I could breathe, where life felt quiet and steady. My kids loved fishing off the edge of the dock. My wife loved the privacy, and I loved knowing we had something that was truly ours. But peace never lasts long when power and pride get involved. It started small. Comments slipped into conversations, reminders tucked into HOA newsletters, little warnings that seemed harmless at first. Shared spaces should remain accessible. Guests must follow all community guidelines. Rules that sounded reasonable on paper, but in practice, they felt aimed directly at me. The lake, cabin tucked at the edge of the property, became a point of interest. At first I shrugged it off. Maybe I was imagining things. But the looks from the president, the subtle pressure at every meeting, and the notes left at my door told a different story. Someone wanted access, someone wanted control, and as I would soon learn, saying no to the wrong person in this neighborhood wasn't just a matter of principle, it was an invitation to war. At first, the pressure came in whispers, soft, almost invisible, like a storm cloud gathering far off in the distance. A small letter slipped into my mailbox, a reminder about community cooperation. It didn't name me directly, but the message was clear. My cabin by the lake was drawing attention, and the board didn't like it. I ignored it, brushing it off as just another overzealous HOA note. But then the letters kept coming. First a polite request, then a friendly reminder, and finally a bold, underlined demand. Unlock your cabin for community use or face penalties. Penalties for refusing to let strangers use my private property? That's when I realized this wasn't going to blow over. This was just the beginning. The next week, a bright orange violation notice appeared taped to my front door. It claimed I was restricting shared amenities, a rule buried deep in the HOA handbook, twisted to make it sound like my lake cabin was supposed to be public. They hit me with a $200 fine, due immediately. I could feel the anger simmering. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. I called the HOA office to challenge the fine. The receptionist's voice was flat, rehearsed. All disputes must be submitted in writing. The board will review. So I wrote a detailed letter pointing out that the cabin sat on private property, built long before the HOA was even formed. Weeks passed, and when the review finally came back, it wasn't in my favor. The fine stood, no explanation, no reasoning, just a warning that further non-compliance would result in additional penalties. And sure enough, they followed through. Next came a $500 fine for improper maintenance. Supposedly, the dock wasn't painted in an approved color. Then another $150 for unauthorized gatherings, because my kids had friends over one Saturday afternoon. Every time I paid one fine, another would appear. Every time I argued, I was drowned in paperwork and hollow threats. It was a cycle designed to break me, and if the financial pressure wasn't enough, they made sure to pile on the social pressure too. Neighbors who used to wave politely now looked away. People whispered at block parties, stopped inviting us to community events. A few even repeated the HOA's line, accusing me of being selfish for keeping the cabin to myself. The isolation stung almost as much as the harassment. One evening, I pulled into my driveway and found two strangers standing on my dock. When I asked what they were doing, they told me the HOA president had given permission to use the lakefront for fishing. I told them it was private property, and they left, but not without muttering under their breath about how rude I was. That was the moment I knew the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were actively undermining me. I started documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every unwanted visit. I took photos of the notices, timestamps of the harassment. I built a case, not knowing exactly what I would do with it, but sure I'd need it someday. Meanwhile, the president escalated. She began showing up in person, knocking on my door, insisting I do the right thing for the community. She'd smile for the neighbors, playing the role of a caring leader. But behind that smile was sharp steel. Her words dripped with threats. It would be a shame if this kept escalating. You don't want to make life harder for yourself. Each time she said it, I felt a chill, and life did get harder. Suddenly my mailbox was dented. My garbage cans mysteriously disappeared. My kids' bikes, once safe on the porch, were found tossed into the bushes. I couldn't prove it was the HOA, but I knew, everyone knew. The worst came one night when I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Peeking through the blinds, I saw flashlights scanning across the dock. Two figures were trying to pry the lock off the cabin door. I shouted and they ran, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about fines anymore. They were willing to break in to prove a point. I reported it to the police, but the officer shrugged. "Civil matter," he said. "Talk to your HOA." That was the breaking point. Instead of bowing to their demands, I doubled down. I reinforced the locks, installed cameras, and refused to pay another cent in bogus fines. I stopped showing up to board meetings, knowing they were nothing more than a performance. But the board wasn't done with me. Oh no. They announced at the next community meeting, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, that I was in violation of multiple agreements and that foreclosure proceedings could begin if I didn't comply. Foreclosure. They wanted to take my home. The crowd murmured, some in shock, others in smug agreement. I stood there, heart pounding, fists clenched, staring at the president as she smirked, relishing the power she held. That night I lay awake, wondering how far they'd go. Would they really try to take my house? Could they? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was clear. This was no longer a petty dispute. This was war. And as I stared at the stack of notices, photographs, and recordings I'd collected, I realized I finally had enough ammunition to fight back. But fighting back would come at a cost. The board thought they had me cornered. After months of fines, harassment, and threats, they made their boldest move yet. An official letter, stamped and sealed, declaring the HOA's intent to foreclose on my property. Not just the cabin, my entire home. I remember holding that letter in my hands, my chest tightening as I read the words over and over. Failure to comply, outstanding fines, board decision unanimous. It was written so coldly, so matter-of-fact, like my life could be erased with a few signatures and a rubber stamp. My wife's face went pale when she read it. My kids overheard the whispers, asking if we'd have to move. That night, as they slept, I sat awake in the living room, the documents spread across the coffee table. The HOA thought this was checkmate, but they underestimated one thing. I wasn't just collecting their notices and threats out of paranoia. I'd been building a case. Every fine, every rule twist, every neighbor's testimony, all of it carefully documented. And now, staring at their foreclosure threat, I realized this was my moment to turn the tables. But if I was going to fight back, I couldn't do it quietly. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about the foreclosure threat, and curiosity drew a crowd. Some came to see me humbled, others just wanted to witness the drama. I walked in with a folder tucked under my arm and a camera strapped to my chest, recording every second. The president sat at the head of the table, her smile sharp as glass. "We are here to discuss Mr. Jackie's continued violations," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "This community cannot function if one homeowner believes the rules don't apply to them." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded along, others glanced at me with pity. I stayed silent, letting her spin her web. Then she brought out the foreclosure notice, holding it up like a trophy. "The board has decided unanimously. Unless he complies, his property will be seized." Gasps filled the room. My heart pounded, but I stood tall. "That's interesting," I said finally, my voice steady. "Because what you're trying to do isn't just unethical, it's illegal." The room fell silent. I pulled out my folder and began laying the papers across the table. Copies of their notices, photos of vandalism, recordings of their threats. Every piece of evidence, time-stamped, catalogued, undeniable. "Here's the first fine you issued. For a rule that doesn't exist," I said, holding it up. "Here's the letter demanding access to private property, a cabin built decades before this HOA was even formed. And here," I said, pressing play on a recording from my phone, "is your president admitting that her goal is to make an example out of me." The president's face drained of color. Whispers erupted in the room, louder this time, sharper. Some homeowners leaned forward, eyes wide. Others shook their heads, realizing just how deep the board's corruption ran. But I wasn't done. "You want to talk about rules?" I continued. "Let's talk about your violations. Using HOA funds for personal expenses, granting special exceptions for friends while targeting others, and most of all, threatening foreclosure on a property you have no legal authority to touch." Gasps turned to outrage. Someone shouted, "Is that true?" Another demanded, "We need answers." The president tried to speak, her voice trembling. This is all taken out of context. He's twisting." I cut her off. "No, these aren't my words. These are yours. And unless you want this entire neighborhood to see what happens when power is abused, I suggest you explain yourself right now." The room erupted. Homeowners shouted over one another, some demanding the president step down, others calling for a vote of no confidence. The board members exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing the shield of authority they'd hidden behind was crumbling. For the first time in months, I felt the tide shift. The president slammed her gavel, desperate to regain control. "Order! Order!" she shouted, but her voice no longer carried weight. No one listened. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. "You thought you could bully me into submission. You thought you could take my home, my family's peace, my dignity. But you forgot one thing. When you abuse power long enough, the truth always finds a way out." Her hand trembled on the gavel. I straightened, gathering my papers. I've already filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Every piece of evidence you see here has been submitted. This meeting, this foreclosure threat, this entire sham, it's all being reviewed as we speak. So if you want to keep digging this hole, go ahead. But just know, you're not burying me. You're burying yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, one by one, voices rose from the crowd. "Enough!" someone shouted. "We want a new board!" another cried. The momentum built, a wave of anger crashing down on the very people who had ruled. With fear, the president's face twisted, a mix of rage and panic. She slammed the gavel one last time and stormed out, her authority shattered. I stood there, heart racing, the adrenaline coursing through me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight lift. The board had been exposed. The neighborhood had seen the truth. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because even when the villain is unmasked, the damage they leave behind doesn't vanish overnight. And as I walked out of that meeting, neighbors whispering, some apologizing, some avoiding my gaze, I couldn't help but wonder, what would the fallout look like? The storm had broken, but the echoes lingered. In the days following that explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. The board members, once untouchable, were suddenly vulnerable. Neighbors who had once whispered against me now whispered against them. The smirks and silent judgments I'd endured for months were replaced by cautious nods, sheepish apologies, and, from some, awkward silence. It was strange, almost surreal. The people who had watched me drown without lifting a hand were now scrambling to distance themselves from the very board they'd defended. Fear had shifted direction, and for once it wasn't pointed at me. The president, of course, didn't go quietly. Within 24 hours, she sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming that my outburst at the meeting was orchestrated, that I had misled the community with selective information. But by then, the damage was done. Homeowners had seen and heard too much. They weren't buying her excuses anymore. And then came the hammer blow. The State Attorney General's office opened an official investigation. I received confirmation in writing. My complaint, along with the evidence I'd submitted, was under active review. The board's finances, decisions, and actions were suddenly under a microscope. The fallout was swift. Within weeks, the treasurer resigned for personal reasons. Another board member quietly moved out of the neighborhood altogether. And the president, once so confident in her grip on power, found herself facing not just scrutiny, but possible charges for misuse of HOA funds. The smirk that had haunted me for so long vanished, replaced with desperation. She avoided public appearances, skipped meetings, and eventually, under pressure, stepped down. It was over. The board that had tried to strip me of my home, my peace, and my dignity had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But victory didn't feel as clean as I expected. Yes, the foreclosure threat was gone. Yes, the bogus fines were wiped away. Yes, my family and I finally had room to breathe. But scars remained. Trust was shattered. Neighbors still eyed me with a mix of guilt and suspicion. Some couldn't forgive themselves for staying silent when I needed support. Others resented me for being the one to topple the system, even if it was rotten to the core. The lake cabin, once my sanctuary, carried a new weight. Every time I unlocked its door, I remembered the night intruders tried to break in, the letters demanding access, the endless harassment. Peace returned, but it was fragile. Fragile in a way I hadn't known before. And yet there was pride, too, because I hadn't folded. I hadn't let them bully me into submission. I had stood my ground, not just for myself, but for my family, and, in a way, for every homeowner who had ever been crushed by the petty tyranny of an HOA board. The strangest thing of all, some neighbors thanked me, quietly, privately, in hushed tones on sidewalks or quick words over the fence. They admitted they'd been too scared to speak up, too afraid of fines or retaliation. One older couple even confessed they'd thought about selling their home just to escape the constant harassment until they saw me stand up and win. That's when it hit me. This fight wasn't just about my cabin. It was about something bigger. Power, when unchecked, festers. It corrupts. And in neighborhoods across the country, small boards wield outsized authority, often in ways that go unchallenged, because people fear rocking the boat. But sometimes the boat needs to be rocked. The HOA eventually restructured. New elections were held. For the first time in years, fresh faces, regular homeowners, not power-hungry busybodies, took seats on the board. They promised transparency, fairness, and accountability. Whether they'll keep those promises, time will tell. But at least the cycle of abuse had been broken, at least for now. As for me, I learned more than I ever wanted to about rules, bylaws, and the lengths some people will go for control. But I also learned something about myself. I learned that silence is surrender. That if you don't push back, even when the odds are stacked against you, you're not just giving up your rights. You're giving permission for bullies to keep going. And I learned that courage doesn't always look like dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's the quiet, stubborn refusal to give in, the decision to stand firm, even when your knees are shaking. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. The nights of stress, the confrontation, the legal headaches, they were all worth it for the lesson, for the victory, and for my family. Now, when I stand on the porch of our lake cabin, I place my hand on the railing, feeling the wood warm from the afternoon sun. My wife's hand lightly touches mine, a silent signal of support and shared resilience. My kids run and play near the dock, laughing freely, unaware of the battles fought to preserve this peace. The lake reflects the golden sunset, calm and serene, a mirror of the hard-earned stability we've reclaimed. In that moment, I understand something crucial: standing up to injustice, no matter how small it seems in the grand scheme of things, creates ripples that restore balance, inspire courage, and sometimes change the world, one neighborhood at a time.